The stagecoach lurched to a hard stop in front of the general store. The jolt so sharp it nearly threw Grace Anderson from her seat. Outside, a Montana blizzard screamed through the narrow streets of the little town of Hecla. Snow blowing sideways so thick it swallowed the world whole. Wind slammed against the coach like an angry fist, rattling the walls and freezing the air inside. Grace pressed her gloved hands to the frosted window and saw nothing but white, no buildings, no people, just a storm that felt like it might erase her entirely. 2000 m. That was how far she had traveled from Boston to reach this place. 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never seen. Her whole life now balanced on this single moment. The driver's shout barely carried through the wind, but Grace knew what it meant. This was the end of the line. Her heart pounded as she fastened the last button on her wool coat. Back home, it had seemed thick and sturdy. Here in January of 1878, it felt useless. She drew in a breath, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped down into snow that came up to her knees. The cold struck her like a blow. The wind tore the breath from her lungs and ripped the bonnet clean off her head. She stumbled, her boots sliding on ice, panic flashing through her chest. Before she could fall, strong hands caught her by the arm. "Miss Anderson." The voice was deep and calm, steady enough to cut straight through the chaos of the storm. Grace looked up into a face marked by wind and sun with eyes as blue as a summer sky. Snow clung to the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his heavy coat. He was taller and broader than she had imagined, solid in a way that made the world feel less likely to break apart. "I am Grace Anderson," she said, her teeth chattering. "Owen Ellis," he tipped his hat slightly. "I've been waiting out here in this cold for you." There was no complaint in his voice, just a simple truth. His hand stayed firm on her arm, holding her steady against the storm. "I'm sorry," Grace said. "The train was delayed in Chicago, then again farther west. Come inside before you freeze." Owen took her travel bag with his free hand and kept his arm linked with hers. "We'll talk where it's warm." He guided her through the snow toward a small building beside the general store, its windows glowing with soft yellow light. Every step felt like work. Her skirts grew heavy with snow, her legs burning from the cold. By the time Owen pushed the door open, she could no longer feel her toes. Warmth wrapped around her like a blessing. A pot-bellied stove glowed in the corner, filling the room with heat. It was half office, half living space. A desk sat by the window, papers neatly stacked. A narrow bed rested against the far wall. Everything was clean, simple, and orderly. "Sit here," Owen pulled a chair close to the stove. "I'll make coffee." Grace sank down, her legs shaking. She watched him move with quiet confidence, tending the fire, filling a worn coffee pot. Measuring grounds like this was a ritual he knew by heart. He moved like a man used to relying on himself. "You're the sheriff," Grace said, noticing the star pinned to his vest. "Town marshal," Owen corrected gently. "Similar work." "Did my letters not say so?" "They did." Heat rushed to her face. "I'm just a bit flustered." "No need." He handed her a tin cup of coffee. "You came a long way. That takes grit." Grace wrapped both hands around the cup. It was desperation. The words slipped out before she could stop them. She winced, but Owen only nodded and sat across from her. "I suppose we're both desperate in our own ways," he said. "Otherwise, we wouldn't be here." His honesty startled her. In his letters, he had been polite and careful, never revealing much. Hearing him speak so plainly felt like kindness. "I should tell you," Grace said softly. "I may not be what you expected. None of us ever are." Owen studied her with steady eyes. "I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for a partner. Please call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated slowly. "And you'd best call me Owen." Outside, the wind howled. Grace glanced at the door at the storm that had carried her here. "Will we be married tonight?" she asked. Owen shook his head. "The preacher lives miles out. We'd freeze before we got halfway. I've arranged a room for you at the boarding house. I'll stay here. We'll marry once this storm breaks. Relief and disappointment tangled in her chest. Part of her wanted it over with, the waiting done. Another part was grateful for the pause. The walk to the boarding house felt endless. Snow blinded her, the wind stealing her breath. Owen wrapped a scarf around her face and kept hold of her arm, steady as stone. When they finally reached the door, Grace was shaking hard, ice clinging to her lashes. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, took charge the moment she saw Grace. She ushered her inside, helped her upstairs, and settled her in a small, clean room with a fire already burning. You're safe now, the woman said firmly. We'll get you warm. Owen brought Grace's bag to the room and turned to leave at once. Thank you, Grace said, clutching the quilt around her shoulders. Owen paused. Warmth flickered in his eyes. I'm glad you made it safely. That night, as the storm raged on, Grace lay awake, listening to the wind. Tomorrow, if the weather cleared, she would become Owen Ellis's wife, a stranger, a man with a past she did not yet know. Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in her mind. Owen had lost his wife and child years ago. Grief clung to him like a shadow. Grace thought of Boston, of her father's death, of deaths that swallowed everything, of the life she had fled because it promised only misery. This marriage had been a gamble, a desperate leap. But she remembered Owen's steady hand, his calm voice in the storm. Maybe there were worse ways to begin a life. Morning dawned bright and brutally cold. The storm had left the town buried in deep glittering snow. Mrs. Patterson helped Grace into her best dress, a deep green wool gown. Owen arrived at noon, sharp, freshly shaved, wearing his best suit. When he saw Grace, he stopped short, surprise plain on his face. You look lovely, he said. And you look very handsome. The church was small and plain, filled with just a handful of townsfolk. Grace stood beside Owen, her hand in his, feeling the solid warmth of him. When the preacher spoke the final words, and Owen kissed her, gentle and respectful, Grace felt the weight of the moment settle deep in her bones. She was married. As Owen led her through the snow toward the house that would now be hers, Grace's heart raced with fear and hope tangled together. She had come through a storm to reach this man, and whatever waited ahead, there was no turning back now. Owen carried Grace over the threshold of the small house, his arms steady as if she weighed nothing at all. The gesture startled her, but it also made something warm bloom in her chest. He set her down gently inside, shutting the door against the cold. The house smelled of wood smoke and clean air. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the space felt ready, prepared, as if it had been waiting just for her. I wanted everything to be warm when you arrived, Owen said, suddenly sounding unsure of himself. It's perfect, Grace replied. And she meant it. Compared to the cramped, grim rooms she had known back east, this place felt like a promise. The house was simple but well cared for, a sturdy table, a few chairs, shelves lined with books, and a kitchen corner with a solid stove. Owen showed her the bedroom, pausing at the door like he wasn't sure how to cross that line. If you'd rather take this room alone, he said carefully. I can sleep in the other. Grace studied his face and saw no demand there, only concern. She placed her hand on his arm. We're married, Owen, she said softly. We'll share it. He nodded, relief flickering across his features. I'll go at your pace. That night passed quietly. They spoke little, learning each other in small ways. Owen cooked a simple stew, better than he claimed. Grace unpacked her few belongings, placing them carefully as if anchoring herself to this new life. When they finally lay down together, it was awkward and hesitant, but gentle. Owen kept his word, moving slowly, making sure she was comfortable. Grace fell asleep, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, feeling safe in a way she had not felt in years. Days settled into a rhythm soon after. Owen rose early, pulling on his boots and coat to make his rounds as town marshal. Grace learned the house, learned the stove, learned how the light moved through the windows. She walked the streets of Heckler, getting to know the town. It was small, dusty when the snow melted, but full of people who watched her with open curiosity. Most were kind. Mrs. Patterson visited often. Martha Hayes from the general store invited Grace for coffee. Slowly, the town began to feel less like a strange place and more like a community. Grace found her place at the schoolhouse, helping Miss Harmon with the younger children. The sound of laughter and recited lessons filled a part of her that had been empty for a long time. Owen listened intently each evening as she told him about her day, about the children and their struggles and small victories. "You were meant for this," he told her once, pride clear in his voice. Trouble came quietly. Small thefts around town, tools missing, food gone. Owen carried the weight of it home with him, his jaw tight, his eyes tired. "They're not bad men," he said one night, "just desperate." Grace listened, then offered an idea. Temporary work, shared food, community help instead of punishment. Owen studied her like he was seeing her anew. That might just work. It did. The theft stopped. The men found honest work. The town breathed easier. And Owen's respect for Grace deepened into something warmer, something softer. Spring arrived slow and careful. Wildflowers pushed through thawing ground. Grace realized one morning that she was with child. When she told Owen, joy and fear crossed his face in equal measure. "This time will be different," she promised, seeing the shadow of his past losses. "We'll be careful." The months that followed were filled with quiet happiness and anxious hope. Owen hovered more than she liked, but she knew it came from love. When labor came with the first snow of autumn, it was long and hard. Owen stayed by her side, holding her hand, whispering strength into the dark. When their son finally cried out, healthy and strong, Owen wept openly. They named him Oliver. Fatherhood softened Owen in ways Grace hadn't known were possible. He held the baby like something sacred, his old grief easing little by little. Life moved forward. Another child came, then another year, then many. Their love grew steady and deep, built on shared days and shared burdens. The fear that had once followed Grace faded, replaced by a quiet certainty. She had come to Hecca, desperate and afraid. Now she stood rooted in a life she had built, side by side with a man who had once been broken, just like her, and neither of them had given up. The years did not rush past all at once. They moved steady and sure, one season at a time, like footsteps on a well-worn trail. Grace and Owen built their life the same way, slowly, carefully, with intention. Heckler changed as the years went on. The silver mines faded, ranches grew, and the town learned to survive on hard work instead of luck. Through it all, Owen remained a man folks trusted. He wore his badge for many years, fair but firm, known for listening before judging. When he finally hung it up, the whole town turned out to shake his hand. Grace returned to teaching once the boys were older. The schoolhouse filled with generations of children who learned their letters under her watchful eye. She taught them more than reading and numbers. She taught them patience, honesty, and how to stand back up when life knocked them down. Oliver grew into a thoughtful young man who loved books and law. Oscar was restless, drawn to open land and hard work. They were different in every way, but both carried their parents' values deep in their bones. Grace watched them grow with pride so strong it sometimes made her chest ache. There were hard times, winters that felt endless. Years when money was tight, illness that came too close for comfort. Once Owen broke his leg chasing a thief and Grace ran the household alone for months. Another time Oscar nearly died of pneumonia and they spent long nights praying by his bed. But they never faced anything alone. On their 10th anniversary, Owen took Grace back to the general store where she had first arrived. It was summer now, warm, bright, children played in the street. "Any regrets?" he asked. Grace looked at the man beside her, older now, strong still. The same man who had waited in the cold. "Not a single one," she said. The years rolled on, full and rich. Grandchildren arrived. Laughter filled the house again. Grace and Owen sat on the porch in the evenings, hands linked, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. They spoke often of that first storm, of how fear had brought them together. "We were both waiting," Grace said once. "For what?" Owen asked. for a place to belong. Time softened them, but never dulled their love. It changed shape, becoming quieter, deeper, less fire, more warmth. They still held hands, still shared looks that said everything without words. In their 62nd year together, Owen passed peacefully in his sleep. Grace held his hand as he went, whispering her love. Her grief was heavy, but it was full of gratitude. They had been given a lifetime. At his funeral, the town overflowed. Friends, family, generations touched by his kindness. Grace stood strong, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried Owen's spirit forward. She lived 3 more years, sharp and steady, telling stories and holding babies. When she passed, they buried her beside Owen beneath a tall pine, the mountain's standing guard nearby. Their stone read simply, "He waited in the cold. She came through the storm." Together, they found home. Long after they were gone, their story lived on, told around fires, whispered on porches. A reminder that love does not need perfect beginnings. Sometimes it just needs 2 people brave enough to